I'm glad Ananke got some. It is my extreme pleasure to introduce my guest for this amazing session, Ms. Vaishnavi Pallapothu, Head Feminist Foreign Policy. Thank you for taking the time to join us for this chat. My name is Haa Joy from Nigeria. I will be hosting this session. So before we start, a little bit about myself. I am a community peace ambassador who is passionate about gender issues, especially as it relates to women and the girl child. I am an advocate for women's involvement in peace building and making decisions, and strive to make the most of opportunities to impact youth, girls, and yes, women in my network and beyond. I hold a bachelor's degree in political science and a member of the Institute of Human Resource Management. Event facilitation has given me opportunity to see how things are moving in exciting new direction and connecting with amazing women and girls who are passionate about adding value and making positive change in the society. So, Vaishnavi, I would like to begin by you telling us a bit about yourself and what inspires you about feminism.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction, Joy, and thank you for having me on the Girls Summit. It's really an honor and a pleasure. So, I just completed my bachelor's degree in international relations, and I intend to pursue a master's degree in the same field, hopefully next year. And by then, this COVID nightmare will die down. So, yeah, right now I'm working as a writer and researcher for the Gender Security Project, and I'm also the co-host of the Feminifesto podcast there, and that's how I know Miss Sabine as well. So I would say that I first started calling myself a feminist in 2016, around 4 years ago. This was a very turbulent time in international affairs because of two particular events. That is the election of President Donald Trump in the United States and Brexit in UK. So these events kind of shook the world in terms of in a political sense, and I really wanted to understand, why this happened. So as I began reading more and more about these events, I also began reading about feminism and feminist critiques of these events, and that's what really got me into the field. And I also started to read more about intersectional feminism, and I began engaging with feminists through volunteering, and that's what kickstarted it all. And to me, I think feminism is the most inclusive ism out there. It encourages people everywhere to embrace themselves, to speak their truth to power, to fight for their voices to be heard, and it calls for shattering glass ceilings, to break down barriers, put an end to structural violence and patriarchy. And for me, the beauty about feminism is that it's so flexible, it means something different to each and every person. It can be deeply personal, but it's also very political, and it holds space for everyone who wants a more equitable world. I could go on and on, but in a nutshell, I think feminism inspires me not only to envision a more equal and hopeful world, but also work towards it.
Oh, that's amazing. Um, so, what exactly is feminist foreign policy?
Right. So, unfortunately, there is no definition of feminist foreign policy that is set in stone. There is only right now. There are only a small sample of countries who have adopted such a policy, and none of them have explicitly defined what makes a foreign policy feminist. So there is a lack of a single cohesive definition. But right now, what the countries that have adopted it are doing is changing the existing status quo and the existing paradigms of foreign policy to include women and gender in their theory and practice. So, according to the ICRW, a feminist foreign policy is one that is based on the political, economic, and social equality of the sexes, and it's delivered to advance women's rights and interests around the world. So this includes conscious and deliberate efforts to include more women in diplomacy as ambassadors, as representatives, as diplomats, and as members of the foreign ministry. But it really needs to move beyond this binary, and it should take a non-binary but gendered lens, and recognize and seek to correct for historical and patriarchal, racist and neo-colonialist imbalances of power and how they play out on the world stage.
Okay. Okay. Wow. So I guess there should be like components of this feminist foreign policy. I don't know if you have this indispensable component.
Right. So, ideally, a feminist foreign policy would basically implement a feminist approach across all the so-called high politics levers, such as aid, diplomacy, trade, and defense. But really, ideally, a feminist foreign policy should be intersectional in nature, which means that gender doesn't exist in isolation, right? It interacts with other social categories, and it considers multiple factors of oppression like ethnicity, ability, religion, sexuality, caste, class, indigeneity, and so on. So a commitment to an intersectional feminist foreign policy would ensure that it's informed by those that it seeks to empower. And a few other crucial factors include a foreign policy that is demilitarized, because arms deals, building nuclear weapon arsenals, increasing military budgets, warmongering, and supporting wars that are outside of home. These are all antithetical to a feminist foreign policy. So it should be anti-militaristic in nature and put human security at the center. So Canada's feminist foreign policy has come under fire recently. Even though France and Sweden are complicit too, it failed to recognize the gendered impacts of weapons proliferation. Aid is also very important of feminist foreign policy. And feminist foreign aid basically means that the country devotes as much of its foreign aid as it can to invest in projects that are geared towards building gender equality. There should also be a respect for indigenous rights. So respect and dignity should be given to native communities and indigenous people and their struggles for their rights and self-determination. So this is by no means an exhaustive list because it's highly context driven and specific to each country's needs and history. But it should not be limited to just any single lever of international relations. But I would say this one thing. A feminist foreign policy should really commit towards having a rigorous and independent practice for monitoring, for evaluation, for feedback, and for ensuring that it's properly implemented. Otherwise, all of these things just don't translate well from paper to action.
Wow, wow, that's awesome. So far you made mention of foreign policy, that feminist foreign policy as it has been adopted. Yeah. So which countries have adopted it so far?
Right. So far we have about 4 countries which have officially claimed to have a feminist foreign policy. Sweden was the first one, and it kind of pioneered this whole movement back in 2014. And it has by far the most comprehensive policy so far. So it's based on 3 R's: the rights, representation, and resources. And it's specifically targeted towards improving the human rights of women. And it focuses on things like sexual and reproductive health and rights, the women, peace, and security agenda, increasing political participation, and it has multi-year commitments and targets as well. In 2017, Canada also launched its feminist foreign policy, and it's also pretty wide encompassing. So they have a few feminist trade agreements with countries like Chile. They have committed to eventually having 95% of all of their foreign aid to go towards gender equality projects. During their G7 presidency, they ensured that gender equality was mainstreamed across all other um, parts of the conference, and they have a focus on I'm sorry. Yeah, they also have a gender equality ministry, and Justin Trudeau, their leader, has also boasted having a gender equal cabinet. However, Canada has many shortcomings, and it has been criticized for, persisting with arms deals and continuing to develop nuclear weapons. It has a very poor indigenous rights record as well, so it's a bit of a balance there. In 2019, France also announced that they're adopting a feminist foreign policy. It's not as comprehensive or well laid out as these other two countries are, but they carried the torch forward from Canada and ensured that gender equality was a main concern during their G7 presidency last year. And they also have a feminist foreign assistance program, and they also have strong feedback and accountability measures, which seem great on paper, but we need to wait and see how they play out in real life. And finally, we have Mexico, who also launched their feminist foreign policy earlier this year or last year, if I'm not wrong. They are actually the first country from the global south to announce a feminist foreign policy, which is a huge milestone. And theirs is focused on human rights and gender mainstreaming. And they've emphasized that they want to reach gender parity within their foreign ministry. But they also have come under fire for having a poor track record at home with respect to women's rights because of rampant murders, rapes, and femicides of women, and also a poor indigenous rights track record. So apart from these countries, Luxembourg and the UK Labour Party have also signaled their interest towards adopting a feminist foreign policy.
That's amazing. Okay, so what can feminist foreign policy do for the global south?
So foreign policy has largely been written and dominated by male-dominated structures, and they often leave behind anyone who doesn't fit in the ideal cis-het male sort of standard that they've set. So these systems will inevitably perpetuate patriarchy and inequality and oppression and discrimination, especially when it comes to things like defense and diplomacy. So, a feminist foreign policy, we can't have a cookie cutter approach. We can't implement the same kinds of policies in the global north and in the global south, because the context, the history, and the needs are very different in the global south. So ideally, I would say that a feminist foreign policy in the global south would decolonize international relations, and it would build on post-colonial, post-liberal, and even constructivist ideas of IR. It would seek to dismantle these systems of imperialism, of racism, of Western universalism, and these neo-colonization tactics, and which are perpetuated by the global north, especially through the deliverance of foreign aid. It would address things like the refugee crisis, migration, climate change, religious extremism, gender-based violence and sexual violence. These are all issues that disproportionately affect the global south countries. So it would address these things and seek to empower those that are most affected by it. And it should also lastly try to strike a balance between the human rights paradigm, which wants to give equal rights to every single human, and the imposition of a universal standard of human rights as dictated by the West and the global North countries, which often ignore cultural differences.
Okay, so from what you said about what feminist foreign policy can do for the global south. So what is the need? What actually is the need of feminist foreign policy? Or what is the need for feminist foreign policy to gain more traction globally?
I think there are three main things. So far it's been restricted, like the commitment to feminist foreign policy has been restricted to middle power countries like Canada, France, and Mexico. So if a global superpower like, say, America or China adopted it, it would really set the ball rolling, and it would set a global standard which many countries might be motivated to follow. And quite simply, if more countries commit to it, more countries will follow. So it's really a virtuous cycle in that way. Second, I think there's still a lot of fear around the word feminist. There's still a lot of taboo around it. For example, Scotland, Iceland, Finland, these countries have many domestic and foreign policies which are oriented towards advancing gender equality, both at home and abroad. But these countries are reluctant to place any kind of labels and call their policies feminist because it's still too radical of an idea for them, or it might feel a bit alienating. And lastly, it would be immensely helpful if there was an overarching framework to kind of follow and to regulate feminist foreign policy. For example, UN resolutions, the ratification of treaties, national action plans. Um, Women, peace, and security agenda is often regarded as foreign feminist foreign policy in action, and it's taken as like a skeletal base of feminist foreign policy because they're both very compatible. So, we could use the landmark resolution 1325 to build a sort of framework, an international framework, and integrated into the UN Women or Beijing principles, and even as a goal, as a sub goal of the Sustainable Development Goal 5 of gender equality.
Okay. Wow. So how can young women engage in the feminist foreign policy?
Quite
How
simply,
exactly can they?
right. So it's still a very niche, young, and evolving discipline. So I would say quite simply, young women can read about it. They can read articles, papers, research papers. They can read academic work on it. They can share their research, share their findings with their peers, their professors, their parents, family, friends, everyone. Basically, amplify voices which are calling for feminist foreign policy. They can support organizations like NGOs, governmental organizations, or interest groups, lobby groups who are pushing for the adoption and articulation of feminist foreign policies. They can put their weight behind them by donating their time or their money, or their effort. And this includes civil society efforts as well. And you can also demand it from your local and national policymakers. I think those are the most concrete ways for women to engage in feminist foreign policy.
Okay. Wow. That's nice. But how does feminist policy relate to women in diplomacy?
Right. So the common misconception is that feminist foreign policies or feminist policy in general is conflated with just increasing women's representation and participation in the whole decision making progress. By increasing the number of women as diplomats, as ambassadors, as decision makers, as policy makers. But it can't simply just be an add women and stir approach, as Sahana Dharmapuri says. While it's important to recognize and acknowledge that there has been historical underrepresentation of women in high politics and in the realm of foreign policy, it's not enough to just take women, elite and privileged women mostly, and give them the power of decision making. And we can't also just assume that increasing the representation of women will automatically lead to more prosperous and equitable policies. Because if you don't address the underlying gendered racial assumptions which perpetuate the institutions themselves, we won't be making any kind of progress. So it would be very essentialist to say that by increasing the number of women in diplomacy, we will automatically reach a feminist policy.
Okay. But now, with the COVID-19 scenario, how crucial is it to be aligned with the feminist foreign policy?
This is a great question. So I think we've seen it's pretty evident that feminist responses to the pandemic have been more successful in curbing the spread of the virus. We've heard success stories about the health minister, KK Shailaja in Kerala in India, Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand, Angela Merkel in Germany, and even Tsai Ing-wen in Taiwan. So it's pretty evident that feminist responses go much further in actually addressing these problems. So the impacts of the pandemic have fallen unequally on the most marginalized people in our communities, whether that's the poorest, the women, the non-binary, the LGBTQIA plus community, the ones belonging to a lower class or a lower caste, the ones with health conditions and disabilities. So the pandemic has merely exposed and exacerbated the brutal structural inequalities that make it harder for these people to receive any kind of assistance. And it has showed us that our current idea of security and current idea of policy, which is so which emphasizes military and defense and weapons so much, it's exposed how these are completely failing us in terms of actual emergencies and public health crises, and how our economic systems are really not shock proof at all, right? So I would say that structural changes beyond this pandemic have to they have to go beyond just like a temporary stimulus check or a economic recovery plan. There has to be long-term structural changes within the whole political system and administration of many countries, the majority of countries. And a great way to do that is to adopt a feminist foreign policy, because more than anything, it would give us a durable safety net and ensure that the most vulnerable people don't slip through the cracks, especially in terms of economic security. So I think Hawaii's feminist economic recovery plan is a great step in this direction. So it emphasized increasing support to the care economy, increasing corporate taxes, raising the minimum wage, introducing a universal basic income. And most importantly, it integrated the knowledge and the lived experiences of the most vulnerable in the communities. So, in this sense, it was truly a feminist policy in action. And I think if more countries followed, it would really be beneficial to us all.
All right. So, what are the biggest challenges faced in implementing and pursuing the feminist foreign policy globally as well as in subcontinent?
Right. So globally, I would say that currently there's a lot of illiberal trends in global politics. There's a surge in right-wing governments, populist leaders across Europe, North America, and even Asia. And all of these things will make it very difficult for any kind of feminist foreign policy goals to be achieved on the international stage, because the trends are actually going in the opposite direction. Within the subcontinents, the endurance of structural violence, of patriarchal systems, of Brahminical patriarchy, and the very notion that feminism is a first world issue, or that it's an imposition by the West. Patriarchy, rape culture, impunity, these are all really deeply ingrained within the institutions of our politics and of our society, and that they're often reinforced by caste and class based systems. So, our current leadership, we can't really expect our current leadership to go in the direction of feminist foreign policy, because we have barely made a dent in these systems of inequality. We have barely acknowledged or addressed them. And the politics of today often builds on these very existing inequalities. They sort of divide society. They build on the marginalized struggles and the discrimination that they face. So honestly, it's a long road ahead, especially for the subcontinent, because a feminist foreign policy can't coexist with the systemic failures towards women and non-binary people, because a feminist foreign policy seeks to dismantle these very inequalities, but right now they are only being exacerbated by the current political systems. So it's very difficult right now.
That's that's a strong one. So, but what, in your opinion, can be the result and effect of translating feminist foreign policy into action?
Right. So there's a lot of feminist IR theory that exists, but feminist foreign policy is one of the first action-oriented offshoots of this kind of discipline, and it completely reimagines status quo, right? And it wants to completely reimagine power and security. So a feminist foreign policy not only challenges the global world order, but it seeks to create a more just global world order. So, adopting a feminist foreign policy would challenge the dominant neoliberal understandings of politics and economics. It would seek to dismantle structural and hierarchical violence in terms of race, economics, disability, ethnicity, religion, gender, sexuality, disability, and everything. It would seek to end systems of oppression and discrimination. It will elevate the voices of those who suffered the hardest from being a part of a marginalized community, and the ones who suffer the most from the current traditional forms of security that exist in foreign policy. And overall, it would prioritize development, sustainability, peace, and human security, and give back the power to the oppressed and the marginalized. Especially in India, I think a feminist foreign policy has the potential to be completely transformative, because currently we're grappling with so many issues, whether it's increased religious and communal tensions, border conflicts with both Pakistan and China, the suppression of rights in Kashmir. So, a feminist foreign policy would really push for a transformative justice. It would want to heal traumas and generational traumas with peaceful dialogue and negotiations instead of just gunfire. And most importantly, it would account for the diverse intersectionalities of people, and it would empower the many and not just the few. And it would build a more empathetic political dialogue, which is very needed in these days when politics is so brazen and aggressive and arrogant. And ultimately, it would build a much more equitable, hopeful, prosperous, inclusive, diverse, and peaceful future in society.
Okay, that's amazing. So, our viewers out there and our listeners, we are still here with our guest in the house, Ms. Vaishnavi. And so far, we've been able to understand that feminist foreign policy is um, is a policy that encourages people to fight for their voices to be heard. And then it seeks to create a more just global order. So this actually has been an enlightening conversation for me, actually, and then I believe for all our listeners out there. So, Ms. Vaishnavi, is there anything you wish to add? Any last comments?
I just like to express my gratitude to Ananke and Miss Sabine for giving me this wonderful opportunity to talk about something that I'm both very passionate about and interested in. And Joy, thank you so much. You've been such a wonderful moderator, and you've given me such thoughtful questions. So I actually had the opportunity to read more about feminist foreign policy because of you, and I really enjoyed our conversation. So, and also I'd like to thank Kirti. For me, everything begins with her, and if it wasn't for her, I wouldn't even be here. And she always gives me so much unconditional support. So, shout out to Kirti. And yeah, I sincerely wish that the Girls Summit is a huge success, and that it's received very well by all the viewers. And I hope it inspires people everywhere to talk about these things and to engage in a more just world. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much for our women and girls out there. We understand that we can adopt or advocate for the feminist foreign policy by adding out our voices, even to the civil societies, the NGOs, reading articles and academic work out there. So if we start with that, then we can also do well to make this policy go viral globally, even as other countries tend to see reasons and need why they need to adopt this policies into their system. Thank you, Vaishnavi, for such an amazing session. This has been such an immersive learning experience for me, and I think I can say the same about everybody attending this session. So thank you for that. The next session starts in a few minutes, everyone. So you can take the time to head over to the networking arena or the reception area for more information about the forthcoming sessions. I can tell you that this event is what you wouldn't want to miss out on. Thank you very much and goodbye.